Hey there, Christophe from the French Herbal. Did you ever wonder what major civilizations and figures shaped the history of herbal medicine? Well, that's the question I will attempt to answer in the series of episodes that I called Ancient Roots of Herbal Medicine. This is the second in the series. In the last episode, we covered the period from prehistorical times through the Romans. And here I'll go back in time just a little bit to discuss the influence of the Celts and the Gauls. So the term Gaulois in French or Gauls in English was used by the Romans to designate the Celtic, sometimes pronounced Celtic, people who occupied the territory of present-day France, more or less. I'm not going to give a history lesson here. That's not my specialty, and I'll probably make some gross simplifications that will make historians cringe, I know, but I think it's quite helpful to establish the broader historical context, even if I do it in a somewhat rough manner. Okay. So, in early antiquity, the territory of present-day France was occupied by a collection of small groups and tribes, and there was no great homogeneity. Then, starting in the 5th century BC, the Celts arrived from Central Europe, and they settled in the east and the north of the territory. Now, further south, it was the arrival of the Greeks that marked the development of the whole Mediterranean trade, particularly through the port of Massilia, what we call now Marseille, which is the second largest city of France. The Celts gradually mixed with the local tribes to form a group and a culture with a certain homogeneity. And this group spoke the Celtic language and would be named the Gallic people or the Gauls by the Romans when they invaded the land. These Gallic tribes each had their own territory and chief, and sometimes they clashed over territorial disputes, of course, and sometimes they formed alliances to confront the invader. The Romans, during their travels through France's territory, depicted the Gauls as rough and fairly rustic people who didn't care much for, bathing, and quick-tempered individuals who enjoyed drinking and fighting. An aspect that you can find in the famous comic series Asterix and Obelix. In reality, they were quite sophisticated people. They knew how to organize themselves around different orders and roles in society. There were various trades and professions. The nobility formed the warriors, and the clergy shouldered many responsibilities. Within the clergy, one figure had a very important role. It's the Druid. And this name immediately brings to mind an image of, a man with a long white beard stirring a cauldron with plants in it. And for sure, medicine was one of the Druid's responsibilities. But he was also responsible for religious worship and teaching. He taught apprentices who would then become Druids many years later. Druidic studies could last 20 years. So, the Druids were also healers, and some were surgeons, as we have found metal instruments that apparently were designed to operate on the sick. And the practice of plants was mixed with religious practices and divination, so there was much ceremony surrounding the gathering and use of plants. In this context, let's try to understand how the Gauls did herbal healing. And this is no small task because the Gauls did not write. The only written accounts were those of the Romans who documented Gallic customs when they came. We have, for example, the writings of Pliny the Elder and Scribonius Largus, who was a physician at the court of Emperor Claudius. And Pliny wrote a monumental encyclopedia comprising 37 volumes called Natural History, which remained a reference for a very long period of time. And Here are some of the herbal preparations that the Gauls used. First of all, plants were often taken as infusions or decoctions, so herbal teas, prepared in earthenware pots. For local applications, they would pound the plants to reduce them to a pulp, apply them locally. So we're talking about poultices here, of course. Sometimes they mixed the plant with oil to give it a pasty consistency for application. Sometimes they crushed or they pressed the plant to extract fresh juice for internal or external use. So we find a great diversity of preparations that are actually very close to what we still prepare today in our home remedies. As for the plants themselves, it's difficult to distinguish what came from the Roman influence and from the Greek influence in the south. Based on available historical records, we can identify some specific plants that the Gauls used. So first of all, there is Celtic nard, denoted Nardum Celticum in Roman writing, which is actually a valerian that we can find in the Alps, a rather rare valerian today, Valeriana celtica, which was used for jaundice and other liver problems, and also for painful periods. And the painful period part makes sense since we know today that the plant has antispasmodic properties. It calms the cramps. We have sea wormwood, Artemisia maritima, found on the Atlantic coast, and it was used to eliminate intestinal worms. Later, other wormwoods would be used as well to kill worms, such as absinthe, Artemisia absinthium, or semen contra, which is Artemisia sina. Two plants belonging to the same wormwood family, and two plants that have been used throughout herbal history for worm issues, although they do come with complexities, and that will be for another discussion. Some plants were known to block the effect of poisons, particularly those from venomous snake bites. And given the number of plants classified in this category, we believe there must have been a large number of snake-related accidents. Now, do not try this at home, of course, but this included wood betony, Betonica officinalis, which was some kind of a panacea, widely used for numerous ailments. It also included dwarf elder, Sambucus ebulis, which is no longer used today due to toxicity concerns. We know that the Gauls gathered numerous plants such as stonecrop, St. John's wort, ground ivy, chamomile, burdock, sage, boxwood, etc. Now, much has been said about a particular plant, a sacred plant, the plant of the Druids, which is mistletoe, Viscum album. And according to Pliny's writings, the Gauls specifically gathered mistletoe that grew on oak trees, which is quite rare. And there was an entire ceremony surrounding the harvest, timed according to the moon calendar. There were also ceremonies beneath the oak tree bearing the mistletoe. From a purely medicinal standpoint, we have very little information about the use of mistletoe. Apparently, it was used to counter numerous poisons, again, and what type of poisons, I couldn't say, and also to improve the fertility of sterile animals. Here's a very interesting fact. Some plants were already used for the same purposes we use them for today. Like burdock, for example, was used for skin problems. Wormwoods were used during difficult menstruations. We have Centauri, Centaureum erythrae, which is very bitter. It belongs to the gentian family, was used for liver congestion. And today we're talking a lot about those bitter plants and the fact that we have pushed them away because of their bitterness. They're too bitter for our taste buds. And we're paying the price today with the sluggish digestion and elimination functions. Pliny explains that the Gauls used Centauri to expel harmful substances. So here we find the concept of cleansing and elimination, of detoxification, a concept that became part of the herbal healing philosophy. Apparently, the Gauls also used different resins from conifers. And Pliny mentions Gallic resin, which was prepared in the form of an electuary. That is, the resin was mixed with honey to make a paste for what they called old coughs, probably referring to a respiratory infection that had been badly treated and became chronic. And here the resin helped disinfect the bronchi and liquefy the stuck mucus so it could be expectorated to resolve the condition, a use we still see today with all conifers. A quick pause to let you know that you can grab my free ebook on preparing herbal teas for the 4 seasons. It's full of simple recipes and blends you can make with herbs you can buy or even grow almost anywhere. The link is right below this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Another distinctive feature of Gallic medicine is the importance that was placed on eye care, which may seem surprising. We don't know exactly why, although I will give you my guess in a second. So, quite interesting. Listen to this. They manufactured dry eye washes in the form of a stick made from a herbal paste that had been dried. And in this paste, they could put several plants like poppy, linden, rose petals, quince, boxwood, etc. And if you think about it, you can see the logic. Quince, for instance, is a very astringent plant, so it will tighten up inflamed mucous membrane. Linden is mucilaginous. It will soothe an irritated mucosa. Rose petals are somewhat both astringent and anti-inflammatory. So we do see a certain sophistication in treatment here. And I will repeat this message again and again in this series because one thing we need to get out of our heads is the idea that these ancient people did things somewhat randomly in a primitive manner. Well, not at all. They tested, they refined, they improved, and after several generations, they had effective remedies. The survival of their people depended on it, so it was not taken lightly. But back to the stick preparation for the eyes. So they made the paste with the plants, they shaped it into a stick, and then they let it dry. And they would break off a piece, mix it in a bit of rainwater or oil, and apply it to the eye as needed. So they had invented one of the first dry extract in a compact form, easy to transport and ready to use. Quite amazing, right? So why this concern for eye care? I think it's simply because they lived in smoky huts, and smoke causes a lot of eye inflammation. And this is something we also find in Native American tradition for the same reasons. In conclusion, for a people described as primitive by the Romans, we find considerable sophistication in herbal treatment. We also find foundational principles such as thermal bath, that is hot bath in natural springs. We find the use of plants to cleanse bodily waste, like plants working on the liver and the kidneys. Gallic practice would, of course, have great influence on Roman practice. The Roman somewhat appropriated the knowledge of various territories through their military campaigns, but also vice versa. The Romans would influence the Gauls during the first centuries of our common era. Part of the Celtic and Gallic wisdom ultimately ended up in Roman writings, which would shape the practice of medicine for centuries to come in Europe, as I explained in my previous episode. Gallic practice would also be preserved locally, continuing its oral transmission to persist over time and remain accessible to the people of France. So actually, you see 2 branches of knowledge beginning to take shape. Roman writings that would influence the medical universities of the Middle Ages, intended for educated and often well-born individuals. And also the second branch, popular knowledge, that would persist in its own way, through oral tradition, continuing to meet the needs of the uneducated and the poor. So this concludes this new episode. I'll see you very soon for another episode in which we will explore the period immediately following the fall of the Roman Empire, and we'll speak in particular about Arab influence, which was decisive.